Welcome back to DC Thursday, everyone, and Happy New Year. I hope you've had a great start to your 2022. I'm excited to continue the DC Thursday series with you all. As you know, we explore and expose the most interesting companies, tools, tech in the modern data world. And today is no exception. We have a great guest, Brad Buda from Census. And Brad and I will chat about operational analytics and learn a little bit more how Census is helping data come out of the dark ages and is filling a missing piece in the modern data stack. Brad has exited 2 startups prior, and we're going to discuss the startup lessons he learned along the way that preceded his becoming a co-founder of Census. We'll also chat about Brad's insights on how to find design partners for your B2B data startup. And you'll hear how both Figma and Fivetran fit into the Census founding story. So Brad is a co-founder of Census. Previously, he was an engineer at Amazon. After that, he started a startup called TrackSimple, which was acquired by BlueKai, which was acquired by Oracle. After that, he was a co-founder of a company called Melodium, which was acquired by LogMeIn. And Brad, well, I just want to welcome you to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Pete. I'm super excited for our conversation today. You flatter me, and I hope we can chat about what we're doing now with the modern data stack and the rise of operational analytics, and the kind of curvy road to Census and what I've learned along the way.
Yeah, excellent. Well, exciting to have you here, and I'm sure the community will appreciate the chat. So I'm curious to kick things off. Tell us how you got into programming.
It's funny. My memory of getting into programming was right around, it was basically time to choose a major in college, and there were a few different things I was interested in, but I had always been the computer guy, and so it seemed pretty obvious to get into programming. And I said, you know what, I think I really do want to pursue this as, my education and then eventually my career. And my mom at the time, I was having this conversation with her about, I think I'm gonna go, apply to the engineering school at Michigan and try to get into the computer science program. And she said, well, yeah, of course you are. And I said, what do you mean? And she, goes and digs through the big box of childhood drawings that every mom has and finds the drawing that I made when I was 5 or 6 years old of myself. And, the teacher or I or somebody had written across the top, I want to be a computer programmer when I grew up. And she said, you've always wanted to do this. So I'm lucky that, I know a lot of people, take less direct paths to their career, their vocation, or maybe are still on those paths. But I was the lucky person who has always known what he wanted to do. And so far, knock on wood, haven't regretted that decision. And also lucky just to have access to computers at early ages. Shout out to the fantastic public schools in Utica, Michigan for putting Apple IIs on the desk, or not on the desk, but in the computer lab back in 1987, way ahead of their time.
Yeah. So is this basic programming early on?
Yep. I learned my first programming was basic on an Apple II in 87, 88, 89, somewhere in there when I was about 7 years old. Unbelievable that a school was that forward thinking in their curriculum at that age. I look back at it now, I'm like, wow, I was lucky. So learned basic and then kind of stuck with it. I got stuck in a basic rut for a long time, but through high school, learned Pascal, C++, and then eventually a ton of other languages. But that was sort of the learning journey for me.
Yeah, great. My first computer was a Timex Sinclair in sort of the early mid 80s, I guess. And those were the days when the tape drive would screech stuff, audibly into the computer, which was the guts of your program. So those were the days.
I'm not sure
you take me back.
Yeah, I'm not sure I ever actually learned how the tape drive worked. I feel like that was one of those things the teacher kind of would come over and set out for you, and then you would sort of go on with your basic environment. I don't think if you put me in front of a computer with a tape drive, I could get it to actually do anything.
Yeah, those were the days.
Yeah.
And so from those early days of being interested in computers, how did the interest in data sort of emerge over time? How do you define that?
Yeah, I think a lot of that came from probably kind of fast forwarding a little bit to my first job at Amazon. So I started in Amazon in 2005 on the internal kind of monitoring and performance team. If you're an Amazonian, this was PMET, which I gather is still around. It's just kind of shockingly to me. But at the time, Amazon was sitting on probably the largest fleet of just kind of, we didn't really call it cloud back then, but data center computers of maybe anyone outside of the government, and was generating a lot of data, and was one of the first companies. This wasn't totally new, but one of the first companies to basically say, this data is all valuable. Like even if it seems noisy, you can recover signal from that noise. And so let's save and capture and index and analyze everything we possibly can. And the story of data a lot in that day, I think, was like companies putting a lot more resources into saving and capturing than the analyzing and spelunking. But you have to do one before the other, right? Like you can't even attempt the analysis if you've been chucking the data out the window. So I think, that was a big part of my indoctrination into the importance of data and that was more about like runtime telemetry, logging data, things like that, things that you'd see in Datadog or something like that today. But, I think that all of these things is just along a spectrum. I think that it's sort of a false barrier to say that data is different than business data, is different than, operations data or whatever it might be. Like, I think all of these things are, as we're learning with the modern data stack, more closely akin to each other than they are sort of different silos.
And so when would you say you saw more meaningful data analysis sort of emerge on top of that storage, right? Obviously, storage became cheaper and cheaper over time, and so companies were encouraged to store more and more data. I guess there was a tipping point, somewhere along the way where companies started to believe, well, there's actually additional analytical insights and value we can get beyond just real-time log monitoring, et cetera. Do you have any perspective on sort of when that sort of new data analysis era started to those thoughts started to take hold?
Yeah, I think I think I can tell two versions of that story, right? There's sort of the industry story, and then the my personal version of the story. I think a lot of companies sort of got that religion in the late 2000s, early 2010s, right? If you think about the rise of Hadoop and the quote unquote big data era, that was very much like a sort of a decision by companies that we are going to put resources into like building out, ad hoc and then automated analysis frameworks around these kinds of, these pieces of data. And, you'd start to see the first, like to go all the way back to the Amazon story again, like the rise of personalization, right? Even just collaborative filtering, right? Like people who bought, people like you bought books like this, right? Was like a mind-blowing idea in 2002 or whenever they shipped that feature for the first time. And now it's de rigueur, right? Like you have to have that. And it sort of just pops out of your Shopify store for free. My personal version of that, I think, was, going back to the monitoring stack and the Datadog kind of internal Datadog pieces, I'll call it Datadog, that we did at Amazon, was just the uncanny ability for these relatively simple algorithms with given enough data to tightly predict like what was going to happen with the business day to day, week to week, right? So we had, one of the main things, my team's main product was basically a graph of orders per minute across all Amazon sites, updated with no more than 5-minute latency. And there were these really tight little error bars around that graph that showed the prediction of where it's supposed to be. And if it went below that, obviously you would go wake as many people up as you possibly could if it was the middle of the night, and get everyone on deck and figure out like, we don't know why this went down outside of our predictive band, but we believe our predictive band and like this plus or minus 5% or whatever it was around the where the line is supposed to be was shockingly good across seasonal changes, across weekly changes, diurnal, of course, like different geographies layering over each other. And interestingly enough, if the number went above the line, that was also like, well, what's going on here, right? Like we had a sudden spike in orders. And this was the days, like, again, this is digging back into the deep past, but the days of Harry Potter books coming out. And the night that Harry Potter would come out, it was a big deal at Amazon because it was, I think it was Harry Potter 7 was the biggest one that I was part of. I don't remember the name. And it was, just these insane spikes in the order graph. And we'd have to, proactively turn off the monitoring because we knew that this was the one thing our system couldn't handle. But, to go back to the story, like the idea that you could put such a tight band, a predictive band around this is what we expect to happen in the next 10 minutes, and it would mostly happen, is kind of revelatory for me personally of like, wow, like, simple models with enough data can give you really powerful sort of, actionable predictions.
Got it. But ultimately you decided, enough was enough of big companies and you decided to move into the startup world. How did that transpire and why did you decide to leave Amazon?
Yeah, I wish I could say it was some grand plan by me, but it was more of, the right people giving me the right pushes at the right time. So another case in which I've been, fortunate in my career to be surrounded by bright people and who can sort of see like, take a bet on me. But basically my, I think in the intro you said maybe I founded TrackSimple. I was actually a founding engineer. I was not a founder. So I want to give credit to the right people there. But a couple of people I worked with in Amazon, John Ingalls and Ajit Banerjee, basically left TrackSimple to say, hey, we're doing all this cool internal analytics stuff. there's a whole world of online advertising of ad tech that needs this. I don't even know that we were calling it ad tech at that point. And like, let's build them better predictors, better analytics on top of their data. And then that's kind of slowly morphed into, and this is sort of the foreshadowing of the rest of my career. Those people don't have one nice, clean, unified stream of data like Amazon does. They're pulling it from a bunch of different ad tech partners, right? From Dart and DMP and or DMPs and I can't remember what all the different ad tech providers were at that point. And like, you know, CSVs, again, more foreshadowing, CSVs from FTP sites about, you know, here's how this email campaign performed. So the idea of TrackSimple, and I was brought on as the second engineer. The first engineer was actually my Census co-founder, Anton. But the idea of TrackSimple was basically, let's give people a unified dashboard with some amount of predictions and some amount of alerts on how their ad campaigns are going. This is primarily display ads, but some email and other things as well at that time. There's no social really. And let's also make that unified across several sources, right? Like, let's allow our system, TrackSimple, to accept data no matter where it comes from. And those kind of two pieces together, I feel like have, you know, sort of informed my product brain pretty strongly throughout my career.
Got it. Interesting. And so, like, just sort of lingering on the mechanics of the startup experience. You know, first of all, what was it that surprised you most about, you know, starting a company? Like, how is it different than being an engineer? I mean, obviously, there's a multitude of ways it's different than being an engineer at Amazon, but I'm curious which ones most stood out to you.
I think it's a good question. Yeah, there's a lot of ways in which it's different, right? And like, the old joke of startup is that no matter what your role is, you're going to wear a lot of hats, and that's sort of the first thing you learn is that there's when you're a 5-person team, or what, I think I was the 5th person to join, you are basically like, you're going to do a little bit of everything, and a little bit of everything includes a lot of business-facing things, talking to customers, understanding their requirements, partner-facing things, right? Like, again, we didn't have because we were sort of sitting downstream of different data sources, we didn't have a big corporate organization where we could sort of force our partners into a meeting, right? And say like, hey, let's figure out how we're going to work together. It was more like, we have to convince you that we want to work together. And, the key thing for me, and the thing that I took away from TrackSimple and that early startup experience, and that still really like is probably my number one motivator when I wake up in the morning, even today, is the immediacy of being able to connect to a customer, listen to their problem, and say, I have the power to fix that. Sort of either directly by like, I can write some code that fixes your problem, or sort of indirectly by like, I can, marshal my team or marshal my organization to make sure that we can fix your problem. And the incredibly fast feedback loop. I'm blanking on her name now, but our first customer at TrackSimple, our kind of mantra with her, like, she basically said, you gave me my Monday back. And that became the company's motto, like, get your Mondays back. Or no, it was get your Tuesdays back. I apologize. And the idea was that like, she had asked for something that we'd given her an early version of TrackSimple. She had asked for something that was like, hey, could it also do this? Like, because that would really save me like a whole nother day of analysis. And that was like 3 lines of code in our system or something like that. So we did it, and her mind was blown. She's like, wow, I can't believe you turned that around so quickly, and it works. And you just saved me a day of my week every week. And like, that ability of software to just like the leveraged power of software to change people's day-to-day workflows and give them superpowers. And the way that a startup can deliver that immediately and in like feedback loops measured in minutes, hours, or days, is the thing that keeps me going on this kind of stuff, right? Of like, that we can deliver that to our customers and sort of get that instant gratification, like that dopamine hit of, a win.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, having that close proximity to customers and users and being able to have that impact, that can be really intoxicating, especially when you're used to working through layers of bureaucracy in a larger company. So yeah, I get it. That's well said. So how did TrackSimple end?
So TrackSimple, basically, we had a pretty good product, although we had to pivot it a couple of times in terms of, because the ad tech landscape was changing a lot at that point. Interestingly, the first version of our product was totally written in Adobe Flash, which was kind of funny. I think we must have been the last new greenfield application to decide that Flash was going to be our runtime. So I remember we did an early kind of like, well, let's flip this into a Rails app, which is sort of on my technical story, like my first time I got to use Rails in a production application. But we had a few customers who really loved TrackSimple, but it was probably too too narrow of a solution to sort of stand on its own commercially. And I don't want to put words too much in the mouths of the founders because I wasn't so much on the commercial side there. But basically, after raising a couple of small seed rounds, it was clear that it was going to be hard to sell this into big companies with the team that we had. And BlueKai was a natural fit as an acquirer. They had built this DMP, right, which is, for those who don't know, the ad tech industry is a data management platform, basically a way that you can upload databases of your users from a bunch of different services into their tool, and then they can go find those people on the internet, match them, and serve advertisements to them. But what they were missing was the performance analytics piece, right? Like, how are these campaigns actually doing? They had some rudimentary graphs, and they had some, they could ship you an Excel file once a week that was through a fairly manual process that was like, here's how your campaigns are doing. But the appeal of, there were not a lot of things even back then, and this would have been 2008 when we sold TrackSimple, that were giving you kind of these real-time dashboards of here's how this system is performing. By real-time, I mean sort of like less than sub-hour delay was kind of the area we played in. So it was a pretty natural fit for an acquisition. So we went over and joined the BlueKai team and continued to develop TrackSimple there internally. I don't know what the ultimate disposition of the product was, but I know it lived on for quite a long time within there. And that also gave me an exposure to kind of the database world. When I joined BlueKai as an engineer, that was my first exposure to a data warehouse, which sort of both gave me, taught me a little bit about the way that world works, but also gave me a poisoned view of it, because the data warehouse we had, and I don't remember who the vendor was, I wouldn't name and shame them anyway, but it was this thing that you racked up in your colo, and every 3 weeks, one of their techs had to come out and take a look at it. And like, you had to be very careful with the queries you ran on, or you could crash it forever. But like, if you used it for the right thing and sort of followed the garden path, it could just like chomp through tons of data super quickly and give you your answer. And so that was my first exposure to data warehousing as well, was when we joined the BlueKai team and started working on their internal data warehouse. And I actually worked on, again, more foreshadowing to Census, but a front end to the data warehouse that was sort of a query accelerator, where you could run sort of certain queries in a in-memory database that we built, like a custom in-memory database, much faster than the raw, or I shouldn't say much faster, at lower latency than the raw data warehouse could.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, we've reflected on the show before how common this sort of pattern of modern data engineers or startups involved in the data space having this sort of connection back into the ad tech world, because at the time, ad tech as sort of a vertical represented so much significant collection of data that was sort of inordinately larger in scale than any other comparable systems of its time for the most part. And I was an engineer in New York City, and which is sort of where DoubleClick was birthed. And I think the quality of engineers that were comfortable working on high scale low latency systems that sort of came out of ad tech was sort of definitely left a mark on New York City at the time, because there were so many engineers that were sort of pressed to the brink of performance and scale, and just sheer volume of data that they had to process. And so there's a lot of like high quality engineers and engineering experience and lessons and architectures that came out of that time. And a lot of that I see has informed some of the architectural systems and designs and trade-offs that we make even in modern data engineering.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I think that industry has left its thumbprint on the modern data stack in some ways, right? Like in ways that maybe are subtle or not totally obvious. And some of that we've thought about with Census and operational analytics as well. And I think, the rise of, I don't know if it was Google who first pushed this, or maybe DoubleClick, of real-time bidding, right? Of like, you actually need to be able to make a decision within a few milliseconds about whether or not you want to bid for this slot on this web page, really pushed us all in the performance direction. And then the last thing there, like, and I'm sure you ran into this as well, is the inherent messiness of that data, right? Like that this is, and to some extent, these things are correlated. The bigger the data is, that like it's going to get more intrinsically messy, but that there's a lot of cleaning, preparation, deduplication, joining, all the kind of like bread and butter things of the modern data stack as well that need to be done in order to have an actionable stream of data come out of those tools like that.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I just want to reflect for a minute on the challenge that many engineers have in finding co-founders. And one of the things about your story that's particularly fascinating to me is how you kind of started to pick up co-founders along the way.
A little snowball going down the hill.
So you already mentioned Anton,
right?
Who I think you originally worked with at Amazon. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. So he and I were on the same team at Amazon, that PMET team. I think we met in '06. We weren't working on anything together until just before we left Amazon. We had started to work on, um, I, I believe it was called Granite then was the code name, but it basically turned into AWS CloudWatch. So we were the kind of co-leads on AWS CloudWatch and this was the era when basically everything at Amazon was build this internal service as if you are going to build an AWS service, which was a pretty like amazing vision because I think at the time there were only 2 or 3 AWS services. It was like EC2, S3, and SQS, I think was it. But it was still, every single team of the company was going to build an AWS service, and they've definitely delivered on that vision. So Anton and I were co-leads on CloudWatch, and then when he was sort of pulled out of Amazon to go work at TrackSimple, and they asked him, who else should we get? Like, who should be engineer number 2? And I'm grateful for this. He very quickly answered, Brad should be engineer number 2. So that was where we met. And realized, in a startup, right, you're in a small room in the modern day equivalent of a garage. This was a loft in Pioneer Square, sitting side by side every day for, between 8 and 12 hours or whatever it was that given day, and listening to the same music and working on the same problems and touching the same code, and you bond very quickly. So that was where Anton and I first met. Yeah.
So then TrackSimple, then what happened next? Because I think you sort of added another co-founder or two in the next venture, which, if correct me if I'm wrong, became Meldium, as I recall.
That's right. Yeah. So the story there is Anton and Boris, my co-founder at Census and our CEO, were working together on, both of them had very presciently determined that the iPhone was going to be a big deal. That, once that, I think it was the 2nd or 3rd version of iOS where the App Store opened up and they were allowing, non-Apple stuff to run on the iPhone. They had decided that there was going to be a gold rush, and they were absolutely right on, like, let's build applications. And so as things were sort of winding down with BlueKai, Anton and Boris had started working on a bunch of different iPhone apps and just trying to find, very consumery stuff. Their biggest hit, I'm going to publicly shame them here, was something called Puppy Pals, which was basically Hot or Not for dogs. And they had, I think a few thousand users. And I believe Anton's quote at the time was, it earns us about a latte a day worth of revenue. And so they were sort of working on that, and that they got the entrepreneurial bug of we should start something. But maybe, an iPhone app isn't a venture backable startup. And so Anton was, the common thread there between us, right? He said, well, I'm working with this really smart guy, Boris, over here, who used to be like an incredibly technical PM at Microsoft, working on Visual Studio, and like knew more about C++ than anyone in the whole world. And I've got this engineer, Brad, over here, who knows how to sling some Rails code. Let's get all 3 of us in a room together and figure out what we want to build. And there was a long ideation phase there. It was a lot of, and I think this is a common story with the companies I founded, is taking a lot of time, working through ideas and beating them up and giving them each of them their due. But one thing we came back to was this interesting kind of experience I had at BlueKai, where if you had to onboard somebody or terminate somebody, there was kind of a fire drill to figure out, like, what do we need to add this person to, or particularly in the case of termination, like, what do we need to get this person out of, and who are the admins for all these tools? And that led us down the identity path, which eventually became Meldium, which is kind of this interesting hybrid of a password manager and a single sign-on tool, and designed to be more accessible than the kind of heavy, quote unquote, heavyweight tools like, the leaders at that time were basically Ping Identity, One Login, and Okta was just getting started around that time. And we saw those as very heavyweight, and you need, an Active Directory, and you need an admin. And we wanted something that was light and simple and flexible for smaller business use cases, while giving, 80 or 90% of the power of a more full-fledged IDP.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Well, not to gloss over Meldium too much, but I do want to get to Census, because that's where some of the data stuff comes back in.
Yeah.
And you basically, collected a few more co-founders from Meldium, plus one. You added Sean,
right.
And you started Census. So tell us how that happened. Sort of, like, the way I like to ask the question is, what was the key insight that made you want to start Census, or made you need to start Census, as the case may be?
Yeah, so I think, the key with Census was, I don't know that there was a eureka bathtub moment, right? Of like, this is the thing that we have to build. But I think it was a combination of this long thread that I had been pulling on, Anton had been pulling on, and Boris had been pulling on through TrackSimple and then through Meldium, of SaaS is the future. Your data is going to exist in a lot of places. Those places are not necessarily going to want to talk to each other or speak a common protocol or operate on a shared service mesh or whatever it might be. So how can you be pragmatic in a SaaS world about doing as much with the data, the access, whatever it is that you have across lots of different places, across lots of different silos. So, Meldium was an early bet on, and this was, when we started Meldium in 2012, this was still a little controversial that like SaaS was going to come to rule the world, that companies were not going to run a lot of on-prem software. They were going to get software from different vendors. They weren't going to buy everything from Microsoft or everything from Oracle. And I think of Census as kind of a logical continuation of that bet. And now, like, this is no longer a controversial statement, right? To say that companies are going to run on a lot of SaaS and that the churn rate on that SaaS is going to be high, and you're going to have to move from tool to tool, and they're not necessarily going to integrate with each other. But it was still an insight that we had and something that we felt comfortable with, right? Gathering data from those different tools, and then the other half of it was just this sense that we all have, like, this is when I try to explain what Census does to a less technical like relative or friend, and who doesn't live and breathe the modern data stack, right? I talk about how when you call up the cable company, the cell phone company, the airline, and you've just been on their website and in their app and you've exchanged emails with them, and the person you're talking to on the phone seems to have like no idea that you've done any of those things. That's the problem that Census is solving, sort of in an indirect way, which is like, why does this company not have one single view of what their customers are trying to do across all of their different data platforms? Census, the operational analytics takes that in a slightly different direction. And although we do have a lot of people using Census for customer support use cases for exactly that, there's a lot of different ways you can take that. But the idea that how is it that these companies who have so much software, have so much commitment to data, generally have a desire to have a view of their customer that is unified or whatever entity it might be, but it's usually a customer, still haven't managed to pull that off in then 2018, now 2022. And what are the missing pieces in that stack? So that's the sort of high level version of it. The very pragmatic version of that is that Sean Lynch, my co-founder, is like the most connected person in the entire world. And basically what he did for all of 2017 and 2018 was knock on different, VPs and directors and doors at various different software companies and say, what are the problems you have with your user data? What are the problems you have with your user data? Until we found this theme of basically the missing link in the modern data stack is kind of the way we originally pitched it.
Yeah, and I think this is where you've commented that it's like bringing data out of the dark ages, right, to a sort of an outside observer who hasn't been as nose to the grindstone as many of us, sort of inside the data tooling stack, and for the last 6 or 8 years, and maybe sometimes losing the forest for the trees. Coming in from the outside, it looks like it's sort of unfathomable that some of these basic types of data integration, or as you describe it from a business perspective, the view of the customer, just didn't really fully exist in a holistic way. And that's basically staggering, from that view.
And it's not for lack of trying, right? I think that's the key insight. Like, everyone wants this, right? Delta Airlines or whoever, I'm going to pick on them just because I've had to spend some time on the phone with them lately. Like, it's not that they want to have data siloed. It's not that they want their CS reps or whoever it is to be blind to the fact that you've been trying to interact with them. They just are lacking the tooling. And I don't think they're lacking the budgets either. They're lacking the tooling and the software to help them build those kind of interconnections. And so that was, the big insight. And then the other thing that came in there was just like, going back to the story about BlueKai and data warehousing, I had not updated my mental model of what a data warehouse was in the 10 years that intervened there. And so, when we started casting around talking to these companies, data warehouses came up over and over again, and Fivetran and other ETL tools like that came up as well. And we were kind of shocked that data warehouses had gotten good, right? That they were not these expensive, exotic, pets that required careful feeding that sat in your data center. They were elastic, pay for what you use. There were a few different, warehouses that were all sort of competitive with each other, but across Redshift, BigQuery, Snowflake, and a few others. And that they were incredibly accessible, partially due to the success of the ETL space, right? Of being able to say, or really the ELT idea that, like, let's just get the data out of your SaaS in its rawest, purest form. And then we'll deal with what that means once it's all in one place, which is just like a absolute like lightning bolt of an idea to me that, like, I'm on a digression here, but the idea of ETL, right, is this like, get the data out of your tool, transform it to match the destination, and then load it. And the transform it to match the destination is basically like, let's wave a magic wand at the data and make it the right shape. And that's not realistic, right? Like, so the ELT philosophy of just get the data across the wire with perfect fidelity,
Mhm.
because it is what it is, and you can't pretend like it's not what it is. So let's get it into the warehouse, and then we can deal with it on its own terms.
Mhm.
Is a big part of why I think this pragmatic modern data stack and what eventually leads to census and operational analytics can be successful.
Yep, agreed. Yeah, and this notion that you can sort of in closer to real time transform the data into whatever state you need it to be in at that time, instead of just pre-transform it into sort of a one-size-fits-all schema, which we know from experience and years of systems integration doesn't usually work anyway. So I think it allows us that flexibility, to sort of defer the transformation until a specific use case or format, is sort of made known.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the things I like to discuss with founders is how they found early customers, even like one step before customers can be design partners, right? Which is sort of the, to me, it's basically one of the holy grails of being able to successfully move from a seed stage startup to a Series A stage startup in the B2B data world. It's, can you find design partners and early customers? And I think this is the area where sometimes founders, especially engineering founders, because we're not always the most social or have the biggest networks. We haven't invested in our network
Oh.
over the course of our career,
Yeah.
like many other business type people have. And so, one of the issues I had as a founder early on in building B2B stuff was, how do you sort of solve that problem, and how do you find design partners? Tell us how you guys got unblocked at Census.
Yeah, I think it was, a combination of two things. Like, first of all, like it's 80% again, Sean. I give him all the credit for like being like well networked and like being willing to do the legwork and like to go into meetings with, in areas where he doesn't know the topic area fully well and ask sort of quote unquote dumb questions. And I mean that in the most charitable possible way of like, being willing to learn in a meeting and to listen and to understand someone else's perspective of the world is a superpower that he has combined with his great network and his willingness to do the legwork that was just like absolutely transformative for Census in those early, those first weeks and months. And it also leads to a lot of like false starts and dead ends, right? Like there were a lot of bad ideas that we had that thank goodness we didn't pursue. And some of them around data and some of them around like very remote, like only tangentially related to data, but like, integrating different systems. For a while, we were going to build I actually think this is still a good idea. If there's any founders out there, future founders looking for one, a marketplace-oriented CRM, right, where you could manage both buyers and sellers on your marketplace as different sort of entities, but and maybe people move between the two of them. So we spent 6 months or something chasing that idea down. But to go back to the question, like of finding design partners, right, like the lightning bolt moment was a couple of meetings we had, and the company that I'll name from those, who I think is okay with us talking about the story, is Figma, where they basically, walked us through the way that their modern data stack works, where the data starts, how it gets transformed to the data warehouse, what they were doing with it, and the last thing they wanted to do. And they basically said, why can't we put this data back into Salesforce? This shouldn't be hard. And we're like, you can't? Like, we were a little shocked. I was a little shocked as someone who's maybe out of touch with the modern data stack. We're like, can't, isn't there a tool that does this, or isn't this just a few lines of code? And as I've learned now, looking at a code base, it's not just a few lines of code. But we said, yeah, we can build that for you. And we didn't know. And this is the place where I think the superpower that our founding team has is the ability to, in parallel, like write just a little bit of code to prototype something and put it back in front of the customer and say, is this what you wanted? And turn that around in the order of like a few days. And then sort of simultaneously like sell the bigger product vision of, okay, now, if we could do this, that means we could also, of course, the easiest thing to do is say, okay, any source and any destination. It's not just Redshift to Salesforce, it's X to Y. And okay, what does any source mean? Does that mean any data warehouse? Does it mean any SaaS? Like, there's an interesting product line there where you go like, are we an iPaaS or are we something else? But to be able to simultaneously, and it also helps to have a lot of co-founders for that matter, take, half the team, Anton and I basically, hacking on like building this connection and figuring out the right way to get data into Salesforce, and the other half of the team out there selling it while it's being built and being able to demo it in a very raw form and be like, be willing to put the egg on your face of like, hey, like this is a, Rails scaffolded UI, but we promise it'll look better. Is this something you want? Is a great way to sort of like, and then you just got to, like any other sales motion, you just got to hit the pavement and try it over and over again. Like, we had a lot of conversations with people like, that seems kind of interesting, but we had two where, people said, yes, and I want you to build that and I will pay you money for that. And they were with Figma. There were a few other companies, and then Fivetran, interestingly, was one of the first companies where another bit of serendipity, when we did Meldium, we were in the same YC batch as George and Taylor from Fivetran. Didn't really know exactly what Fivetran did. Again, my ignorance of data tools, but checked in with them a few years later and we're like, wow, this is pretty cool what you guys have built. We never would have thought to run a data stack this way. And then came back to them when we were starting Census and said, hey, does your tool do this? And they said, no. And we said, do people want this? They said, oh yeah, everyone asks us for this.
Mm.
And we said, if we built this, would you use it? I said, absolutely. And that was basically like, that's the strongest possible endorsement you could get.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, it's really interesting to hear the backstory and sort of peel back the layers on how a company started. I think it's super useful and insightful for other engineers who are looking to start data companies of their own. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit more about the tech and the architecture behind Census. I'm interested in how you describe your product values and what are some of the guiding principles, of the engineering team or the product team, and how you've shaped the product. Let's start there, and then we'll we can sort of work more detailed down layers the stack from there.
Yeah, I think I've used this word a lot, I think, in our conversation today, but I think pragmatism is a big part of it, right? That like you cannot will your data or your connections to be something different than they are. So approach them on their own terms. And that might mean, building out, a different sort of surface for integrating data into a product analytics tool like Amplitude or Mixpanel versus into a CRM versus into an ERP, right? Like those things are different. They have different facades, and let's not pretend like they're all the same thing. In order to gain abstraction power, you still need to treat those, you need to build up some common models. And a big part of, I think, the first 18 months of Census was us searching for those paradigms of, here are the 4 kinds of SaaS applications, right, or whatever that Census integrates with. And it's more than that, but like, does this look like a relational database? Does this look like an event stream? Does this look like a NoSQL-y, style, like key value bag? And sort of quickly filing, services and objects within services into those categories is a big part of basically how we, when we realize that, hey, we're going to need to build more than 3 destinations for Census, it's probably more like 300. Let's find the common patterns there and start to build out patterns. So I think that's one of the product design principles. I think the idea that our customer is, operating within an ecosystem, I think is the way I would put it, right? That like, we are not going to be the end all be all tool for data integration, that we are going to integrate with other tools, whether it's, something like DBT for modeling, whether it's, Stitch or Fivetran that's bringing data into the warehouse, one of, the 8 or 9 different data warehouses we support at this point, that again, like the companies, no vendor can build a full modern data. I know some have tried, but I think no vendor can build a full modern data stack that comes in one box that's turnkey and comes with all of the connections you possibly need, all of the modeling you possibly need, and a data warehouse in it. Like you have to, sort of play in an ecosystem. You have to be a little bit T-shaped, right? Of like, we're going to do one thing super, super well, which in our case is reverse ETL, and then a few other supporting things at, useful, like orchestration, for example, or modeling. Like Census has a very lightweight orchestration layer, has a very lightweight modeling layer. That's good enough for a lot of customers who haven't invested in a DBT or who haven't invested in an Airflow. But that if they do decide to invest in those things, that we are, again, an ecosystem partner, a player in that world, and that we are compatible and integratable.
Got it. And what about a comparison to like a segment? How do you guys feel you differentiate against a tool of that in that category?
Yeah, I think the key thing for me there is the idea of the data warehouse as, for lack of a better term, a Turing complete like store for data, right? A Turing complete programming language, to the extent that SQL is a programming language for data, right? So the idea, I think one of the key differentiators, for something like us is, it's again like pulling on that ELT thread and saying, let's bring all the data into one place, and then give you a general purpose way to reshape, join, deduplicate, clean up, run analytics on, run, machine learning on, whatever it might be, all in that one place. And so any tool that tries to sort of build in an internal, segment builder, point and click segment builder, or here's some JavaScript you can run against your data or whatever, like those are all going to be inherently limited compared to the power of SQL over massive amounts of data. So let's lean into that. Like, even if SQL isn't the language I would have necessarily designed for this, it's one that a lot of people know and it runs in a lot of places. And it's like, surprisingly standardized, right? Like I'm actually, we have, internally in the Census tool, we have a little dialect engine, right? That's like, okay, what kind of SQL do I need to run? Do I need to run Snowflake flavored or Postgres flavored or MS SQL flavored or whatever? And there's fewer differences than there used to be. Like one brand of SQL tends to run well in a lot of places. So that's a digression, but the idea that you would have a programmable hub for your data, and then once the data is reshaped, programmed in the direction, the style, the numbers that you want, that's the thing you'd push back out to your destination SaaS applications. Is I think what differentiates this from something like Segment, where it's sort of like you have to figure out the programming of the shaping of your data on the fly as it sort of goes from the source to the destination. Like just letting everything sort of land in one place and be at rest there, and then being able to iterate on, through something like DBT or even just in raw SQL on this is what I want my model to look like before I push it back out into the world, adds a ton of power.
Got it. Yeah, and that way it's more open than, LookML, or you don't have a opinionated DSL over the top of what you're doing. So I see how that produces more openness and flexibility ultimately for different kinds of use cases.
Yeah, I think, we've had a lot of accidental integrations in Census because, other tools that play in the ecosystem, as long as they can speak SQL or they can speak tables, they can interact with Census, right? Like very early on, we just actually launched a really like a more sophisticated Looker integration, which I'm super proud of. But early on, people said, "Can I use Census with Looker?" And to go to your point, and we said, "Well, can Looker spit out a table?" And they said, "Well, I can do these things called PDTs." And we said, "Well, then we integrate with it. Like we don't need to write a single line of code, nor do they, because we're both coming back to a shared platform." And there's a lot of tools, Great Expectations in that world, and Monte Carlo, where we don't necessarily need to build an explicit integration. We will, because you can do better things with an explicit integration, but the implicit integration of we're all going back to the same database adds a lot of sort of magical kind of power.
Got it. Well, let's talk about the connectors and the integrations a little bit more, because it seems like for you to acknowledge that there were many hundreds of integrations or connectors that you had to support. How did that drive sort of architectural decisions on that side of the platform?
Yeah, I think it's, I think we were slow to get there. It's one of the, as I look at like what things I wish I would have realized a little sooner. I wish I would have realized that a little bit sooner, that we need to start building out those abstractions. But the key insight, and I give full credit to Anton for this because he's driven this since the early days of Census, is the idea of moving an integration from a how do you push the data in to I hesitate to use this word because I don't know if it's totally accurate, but a more declarative style of let me write some code, a DSL in our case in Ruby, that describes the capabilities of this destination SaaS application, the capabilities of its objects, like what are their primary keys, what are their foreign keys, which ones are unique, what are the verbs that the tool gives you natively, right? And we have this whole long catalog of verbs that we found there out in the SaaS world. Like there's obviously things like insert and update and upsert, but there's way more exotic ones as well, and various forms of merges. And if I write to this API, what will happen? If I update a user's list of tags, will it merge with the existing list of tags, or will it overwrite them? Like there's all sorts of subtlety and things like that, but that you can build a DSL to declare over. And so basically Anton, spearheaded that effort. And now with our internal connectors team has sort of like really pushed the capabilities of that DSL to say, we no longer go write a bunch of API calls, we integrate with the service. I mean, we do, but first we write a declaration of the service's capabilities in a Census-friendly form of metadata. And then our core sync engine can take those capabilities and take the capabilities of the source warehouse too, because not every warehouse is created the same, and sort of, run a compilation step where we say, okay, here's the kinds of syncs that this service can do, and here's the most efficient ways to run those syncs, right? Like we can actually, we're doing some rudimentary work on even like sort of scoring those, right? And saying like, okay, there's actually 2 different ways we could sync this data to Salesforce based on the constraints you've given us and the configuration you've given us. So let's, score that by performance, or let's score it by API call consumption, or whatever it might be, and pick the right one for your case.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I can see how that could be meaningful core IP, considering the fact that you're in the middle and you're sort of becoming this de facto translation, these translation pipes, for you to have a robust way of describing the capabilities of APIs on both the ingest and the export side. I can see how that would be particularly strategically meaningful. That must have been a fun part of the system to work on.
It is, and it continues to be. It's probably the most like the capital H hard problem that we have solved in Census is that like building a are attempting to build a unified language that can declare the read-write capabilities of a bunch of different APIs and a bunch of different systems. And it's not perfect. And the great thing is, you can always eject down into raw code and say, well, this one doesn't play with the declaration system. So, this service will just get a regular connector. And that means that, shipping those connectors is maybe more expensive for us, but it's still doable and we can still do it with the same capabilities. So that's the nice thing about doing that in sort of going way back to the idea of Ruby and the internal DSL, where it's just Ruby code.
Yeah, very cool. So are there other architectural trade-offs that you felt you had to make as you were building the system, or tell me about something that might be sort of a surprising architectural decision that you guys may have made?
I don't know if this counts for surprising or not, but one thing I think of that I'm pretty proud of that we've built that is to build Census in a very recovery-oriented manner. And I don't know if this term is used much anymore, but this was a big term in the kind of distributed systems world in the early 2010s, this idea of recovery-oriented computing. People who've lived in the Erlang or Elixir world will very much be familiar with this idea that you divide some task into logical pieces of work, and any of those pieces of work can fail at any time. And instead of sort of trying to fix the failure, crash it and move on and do it again, right? And so building a sync engine, some of the largest data syncs that can run in Census, I think the longest one we run took 17 days. And that's not because Census is slower, because the data warehouse is slow. It's because it's 10 billion records or whatever it was in that customer's case, moving into a system that can only write a couple thousand per second, right? I can't remember the exact numbers, but sort of do the math there. And we sort of eyeballed this and said, well, this is going to take 17 days to run, if we nail it. And during that 17 days, a lot of things are going to crash, right? Just because we're going over the internet, we're talking to APIs that we don't control. Those things spew out 500s for no good reason, or if you're lucky, they spew out a 500. If you're unlucky, they just sort of don't answer your connection or leave it open and never return a response. So let's start. We'd already sort of decomposed our sync engine into logical steps, right? More for reporting and analytics and telemetry, but starting to treat those steps as units of failure, as hierarchical units of failure. And sort of if part of the hierarchy fails, you just checkpoint and retry from there. And then figuring out there's some subtlety to which kinds of retries are safe and which are not. But most of them, most of the time we're dealing with idempotent operations that are safe to retry and we can sort of checkpoint and move on. So we put a big investment right around 2 years ago when Census was first starting to see its really higher scale customers into building out a reasonable recoverable sync engine that could just sort of pick up from any failure and keep pressing on. And that's been a really important part of our sort of tech stack is again, the insight there is if you get an error, basically crash, right? And let your supervisor decide what to do. Don't try to handle errors for the most part.
Got it. Well, that's your version of failing gracefully. And, that makes a lot of sense. So tell us about, to the extent that you're open to sharing, what are some other features in your roadmap that you're particularly excited about? What's coming down the pipe for Census?
Yeah, I think a lot of what, now that customers have been using Census, some of our oldest customers have been using Census in production for almost 3 years now. And a lot of them have been on it for, a year or two. They're starting to do richer things. They're starting to do multiple destinations and bring different teams into it. So there's a lot of things around how do teams collaborate within Census that we're excited about. I don't know if I can talk about any specific features yet, but how if you have a data engineering team that's providing models and you have a sales operations team that's consuming that for CRM, and then a CS team that's consuming that to power their Zendesk or whatever their CS tool or customer success tool might be. How can those teams all work together on the same data? Is an interesting area for us to kind of pursue, because we are a place. And I think good software tools do this, where different teams come together to collaborate, right? They have a shared set of nouns and verbs they can talk about together. So that's one area I'm excited about, is what we can do to help make collaboration better within Census, and help sort of one of the things that I'm not sure if this is shipped yet or not, but if it hasn't, it will ship very soon. The idea for a data team to sort of bless a particular model is saying this is ready for production, this is ready to be synced, versus this one is a draft. Simple stuff, but workflowy things that make collaboration a lot easier and more explicit rather than implicit. So that's one exciting area. And then I think the bigger picture that we're sort of tackling this year is, the data space has been it's a lot of early adopters, which is great, who are they know a lot about their stack. They know a lot about their data down to the rows of columns, and they know a lot about the fields and the semantics of the destinations. And so if you know what you want to do with data and you know how to do it, Census is a great tool for you. If you know what you want to do with data, but you're not exactly sure how to do it, right now we use our sales engineering, our customer data architects to help you do that. But like moving some more of that into the product is something we need to do as well. Is like, I want to follow a PQL motion. I want to follow a customer support ticket scoring experience. Like, I know what data I have. I know more or less in a flowchart sense like how I want this to work out, but I might not know the details of how that interacts with the Zendesk API. Even though we sort of abstract that from you, like you're still seeing the artifacts of that in the Census tool. So I think giving people a higher level abstraction in a way that people who are systems thinkers, who are sharp and like they get it and they know exactly what they want to happen, they just don't live and breathe SaaS APIs. A more accessible version of the Census tool is a really important thing for us this year as well.
Great. Well, Brad, it's been great chatting with you. We're pretty much out of time, but I did want to ask you a last question before we let you go, and that's essentially, what surprised you most about your work in the data ecosystem so far?
It really is a community more than I would have guessed, right? Like it really interesting to me to the extent to which, and like a ton of props to the team at DBT for like building their Slack and their community, because I think they've spearheaded this. But there's a lot of other great communities as well. But like the extent to which people are willing to share best practices, to collaborate, to sort of jump in and help with someone else's problem that might not even work at your company, just for sort of like, the kudos, the karma, whatever it is of like, giving back. Is really heartening. It's like, clearly this is a group of people who sees the world in a different way than we saw it before, and they want to spread that mantra. And that the fact that we get to be a small part of that is humbling and pretty awesome. And I think it's really cool how so much of our sales has been even for a small company like organic through those channels, right? Like where someone will say, well, I'm using Census to do this, and someone else will say, what's Census? What's operational analytics? What's reverse ETL? And that starts a conversation. And that's I think a lot of credit also to our team for like really making our first cohort of customers incredibly happy and making them all promoters. That's this is not new startup advice, but again, like if you are a founder or you're going to be a founder, right? Like there is nothing you can do more than to make those those first customers incredibly happy and incredibly like, promoters of your tool. Like 1,000 people have said it before, but I'll say it again. And so that like the degree to which things move through communities in the modern data stack and in this world is not something I would have expected. I thought we'd be doing a lot more of having, we have done some awesome marketing, and I'm really proud of our team for doing that. But I thought we'd be having to do a lot more of preaching the gospel ourselves, and I didn't realize the extent to which our customers and our partners would be preaching the gospel for us.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, we're excited to have Census be part of Data Council Austin, which is coming up, and to join the data community there. So we're extremely excited about the IRL event coming up, and it will be great to have you guys participate, and folks can wait and chat with you there, or I'm sure there's other more digital ways that they can reach out to you. What's the best way for someone to get in contact if they want to learn more about Census, or maybe even ask for your advice on their data startup?
Totally. Let's see. So a few ways you can like, best ways to reach me probably are Twitter. So I'm at Bradley Buda. If you sort of like less, you want help with a startup or an idea, or like, hey, what is this modern data stack thing? What is this operational analytics thing? Like, help me understand that. I'm happy to like, answer questions there. And then like a shout out to our own community, the operational analytics community. If you go to getcensus.com, you can find, I should know this, but it's one of the pages. I think it's right there on the homepage to join the operational analytics community. And we have a really active Slack there that's, obviously around, centered around operational analytics, but has a lot of cool side conversations there as well. That's a great place to jump in to learn more about the product. If you're not yet, maybe you're looking to buy Census or a tool like it, and you want to understand how they work, or maybe you just want to learn how this world works and how you can sort of get involved in it. That's a great place to come as well. So those two, my Twitter and operational analytics community.
Great, excellent. Yeah, thank you for sharing those. I'm sure folks will find you there.
Cool.
Well, thanks, Brad. It's been great to chat with you. I hope to see you in person soon.
Yeah, I hope to see you as well, Pete. And thanks for taking this time with me. And we're excited to be part of Data Council Austin here coming up soon.
Yeah, excellent. And to the rest of our listeners, thanks for joining us. Next week, we'll have another interesting episode of DC Thursday with Sumideb Mitra from RudderStack, another important player in the space. So don't forget to hit your YouTube notification bell so that you get notifications about the next event. You can find all of our previous DC Thursday episodes also on YouTube in a convenient playlist, which we'll post in the chat. And otherwise, we're looking forward to seeing you all in person soon. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.